I'm so excited and honored to have Dr. Lisa Auslander back on the podcast for the second time and to have Dr. Joanna Yip on the podcast as well. They're both co-authors of a new book called
School-wide systems for multilingual learner success, a roadmap for leaders.
and you both have such extensive experience supporting schools. So can we start there? And can you please tell us about your current work context?
Okay, so I'll start. I'm Lisa Auslander. I'm the principal investigator and senior project director at Bridges to Academic Success. It's a project out of CUNY Graduate Center that supports newcomer multilingual learners, their teachers. We do teacher education and curriculum development, and we support districts in New York and in other parts of the country.
And I'm Joanna Yip. I'm also in New York City. And I recently joined the team at the English Learners Success Forum, which is a national nonprofit that really seeks to, really improve the quality of instructional materials so that the assets and needs of multilingual learners are embedded in the supports that are in curriculum.
So we often have people come on the podcast and they talk about strategies for teachers, but particularly love when there's a book about for administrators and district leads and superintendents because they make all the decisions that really impact the way we teach. So what was the seed for this book for administrators?
Well, first I'll say that we wrote the book for any leader. So we include administrators, but also teacher leaders as part of this book to address their needs as well, because we recognize that leadership lives in all parts of the school and all parts of the district. And I guess I'll start by saying that we both have experienced firsthand in our work with schools how the lack of a systems approach really affects the way schools serve multilingual learners. And so, for example, there are still schools that haven't been able to program teacher time for collaboration, whether in grade team meetings or in co-teaching partnerships. And then in some cases where there is team time, the instructional discourse doesn't go that deep, or it doesn't go deep enough to address the needs of multilingual learners. So for example, it's not evidence-based, or it doesn't address language and literacy needs. And we don't really tackle pedagogy and instruction in the book because we know those practices can't take hold without those strong systems and structures. And also that's been covered so well in other places. So we really decided to focus on this in the book. And so in addition, besides instruction, we wanted to address cross collaboration and building school-wide systems in socio-emotional learning, discourse among counselors, teachers, staff to boost those kinds of supports. And facilitators and leaders don't always get training just to learn how to lead this work. That's something we felt and experienced as well. So leaders need models of what it looks like to lead this work in schools. So we put examples in the book to share with others. So I don't know, Joanna, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's right, Lisa. I think, both of us, we've had our own journeys as educators. For me, I kind of came to this work, working as a teacher and instructional coach for many years, and have really consistently had a very laser focus on language and literacy, and really hoping for schools to create communities where students can feel agency and confidence in language and literacy so that they can access education. But I think we've learned over time that those instructional practices are really, it's not enough in order to ensure that, that work can really be embedded in schools, and that, those strong systems are really necessary. So, Lisa and I kind of serendipitously, came together in our work and realized that there was a lot of commonality, and we also have done work together. So I think we kind of decided, like, let's just put some of these stories down. We've encountered so many amazing educators that have been doing the hard work, and we wanted to bring their stories to light.
Joanna just shared her story, and I think that one of the things we did want to highlight in this talk today with you is that the answer to why we wrote the book is in our stories. And so as Joanna was sharing her story, I realized that I should also share mine a little bit in like the background. So in my journey, before I knew Joanna, I was an inclusion teacher in social studies at the middle and high school level. And I served multilingual learners, general ed students, and special education students in that inclusion setting for about 10 years. And then I was also co-teaching with both ENL and special education teachers. So this was a big part of my background and what helped me realize that I needed to learn additional skills in language and literacy. I didn't have the background, I didn't have the training. And so my passion for the work and interest in school leadership and organization came through coaching and as a district administrator, seeing how schools and teacher leaders set up learning in totally different kinds of ways to serve students. And I met Joanna in our doctoral program together. And that's where we realized our shared interest in organizational learning. And we're thinking all the time about how to better serve needs, the needs of our multilingual learners. And so I would say, and just to add on to what Joanna said, that the book has come out of years in thinking and reflecting on how school leadership sets the groundwork for those systems and structures to support our students. And that when we came together, we had both been on a journey of kind of our own and then seeing the need for change. And the need for a systems approach to building equitable learning environments.
Yeah, the systems approach is just so important. When I listen to you listing all the things that happen as a system-wide factor, such as like no time to co-plan, like that's such a huge, or no time to collaborate with teachers. That's one thing that can really impact the instruction that multilingual students experience. And if school leaders just plan for that one thing or address that one thing, so many other dominoes fall after that. It's like they fall, or like the pieces of the puzzle fit in when we do just that one thing. Imagine if we address the whole system.
I think I'll just add that I think there's an assumption for, in the field that like the the main element that's needed for supporting multilingual learners is content expertise, right? It's knowing the research, it's knowing the instruction and the pedagogy. And it's not that that's not important, but I think we show that that alone can only get us so far because it can't really stick in the school community without strong systems and structures. So yeah, I think that's the only thing I kind of wanted to add. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. You can have highly qualified, highly trained language specialists, but still working in a system that handcuffs them. And when they're handcuffed, they can't really support students because of the systems. For example, here's another one. I know that teachers always talk about, I have like 27 classrooms, or they're all spread, students are spread all over the place. And just changing one programmatic idea of clustering more students instead of having two students spread across 20, like all the students spread across 27 classrooms, let's have them spread across 12 classrooms instead. And that makes things different for teachers to offer true, more equitable support for students. Just that one decision. Let's move to chapter 2. Can we please talk about the role of teacher-team inquiry in linguistic responsive instruction?
Yeah, so, I think Lisa and I have kind of landed on this as a really important ingredient in schools. And I think it's common knowledge that most teachers in the United States are sorely ill-equipped to support multilingual learners. They don't get much pre-service training, if any, and they don't get much additional support once they get on the job. So they're really working on their own. Most of the instructional materials that are used in schools weren't designed with the needs of multilingual learners in mind. So teachers are constantly trying to pull together, from the internet. They're trying to, they're scrappy, right? They're creative and they're incredibly innovative, but they have to do it on their own. And so there's a real gap between what we're expecting teachers to be able to do and what's actually available to support them to do that job well. But we've found consistently in our work with schools that when schools create structures for team collaboration, they can actually be very successful despite this gaping hole in the system, because creating a mechanism for teachers to support one another, to share their expertise, to problem solve together, enables teachers to do more than they can do by themselves, right? It builds collective efficacy, right? Which is such an important ingredient that makes a school successful for all students, but even more critical for multilingual learners. And so, one of the first questions I often ask when I start my support to a school is to understand what their teaming structures look like. What is their approach for teacher collaboration? And sometimes these structures don't exist, right? And it's very hard to help those organizations be able to tackle the learning and development and the skill building challenges that teachers need support with related to improving instruction. But with teacher teams, it allows practitioners to put their heads together, to do their best thinking, to bring their practice, and reflect on it together and really problem solve. And they can actually, I think, learn far more together than they can from outside experts, actually, right? I always like to say to teacher teams that, like, the answers are in the room. They just need to look to each other as resources. But setting this up requires some key ingredients. And so we do illustrate that in the book, right? It requires training and facilitation to actually lead these kinds of collaborations and conversations among teachers. It requires the work of the team to have a commitment to focus on language and literacy in the classroom. And it requires a hyper-focused lens on evidence of student learning, to really study the language practices of the students to drive that collaborative inquiry and professional learning. So we show some examples of that in the book, and the examples, there's this one team that we describe in depth, and it's not a perfect team, right? It's got problems. The school has its own limitations, but they're working, they're working with what they have, and it's a very realistic example of what's possible even under, not having enough resources, not having enough time, not having all of those sort of conditions that we wish that we had, and seeing a team, still be able to make it work, and what impact that can have on multilingual learners.
Would you be able to talk more about that team then? Just describe to us tell us the narrative of that team.
Yeah, so in this team, they spend a lot of time looking at student work, and that's really at the core of what happens in teacher inquiry, right? And they're like looking at the student work in very small and fine-grained ways. They're not just kind of saying, is this like, a 1, 2, or 3 on a rubric? They're doing like a close reading of their students. And when they're talking about the student work, they're making connections to, what they know about the student's interests, the social emotional aspect, right? Because they know these students and have built these relationships with these students. And so, in that context, the teachers are able to really surface what the students need to learn next, but they're also able to really step back and appreciate what the students are able to do, right? It's so easy for teachers to forget that, as students are learning English, right? And because they may not always look like they're successful, right? That when they often gloss over and miss a lot of things that they cannot see. So these kinds of processes really help teachers elevate and surface what's actually happening with students.
I would add just one thing to that, and that the other thing about that team that has a really skilled facilitator, the coach of the school, who really helps lead that conversation and facilitate, and has a background in language and literacy and can support the teachers in doing that kind of in-depth work. And sometimes that's the invisible work that is happening, that this coach, had learned some of these facilitation skills and really done her own work in order for the teachers to feel successful and for their students. So there's a lot that goes in to building those constructive meetings and productive meetings besides just setting aside the time. It's that's the first step. And then there are many other steps that go alongside that. That's it. We see that, and you can see that in the example of the team in the book.
I also feel like when you were talking earlier, Dr. Yip, about how there's a piecemeal idea of supporting students, transitioning that to a village focus, like the village coming together to support students. And you mentioned collective teacher efficacy, and we know that that's the most important factor in student achievement, when everyone believes that they can actually have an impact on students. And which means if everyone believes that, how do we get there? And you talked about job-embedded professional learning. Let's move to chapter 3. Can you talk to us about how to integrate SEL into teacher-wide planning and instruction?
Sure. So in the same way we talk about evidence-based observations of students in language and literacy, we also want to take into account our students' socio-emotional literacy background and our own socio-emotional literacy and our own socio-emotional learning skills as adult educators and learners. So I think what we've learned is that it's really important to develop a language of socio-emotional learning through a framework. In the book, we use CASEL. In our own work, we use CASEL. And so that's key. And having adults experience and self-reflect on socio-emotional learning as individuals and in the community is really, really important part of building that with our students. So if we don't do it ourselves, our students aren't going to experience it in the same way. So that's really important thing that I found working in schools. Also, we know that understanding students holistically by learning about who they are and other aspects of their lives, in addition to their academic strengths and needs, is so important. We both have really found that in our own work. And the book provides tools to do that. We have an inventory of socio-emotional learning skills. That includes how to help students build their socio-emotional learning through power plans, brain breaks, and just other kinds of activities that are more integrated into the instructional plan and streamlined. The other thing, going back to the whole collaboration piece, is that how staff collaborate around student needs is also really key, whether that be in a teacher team meeting or across teams. So, often administrators, counselors, school staff, and educators need to come together, which can be very challenging in some of our schools. However, this collaboration is what really can lead to results for student outcomes as well. And we have one example in the book of how school increased attendance among multilingual learners because they had this compassionate and strategic outreach that they did, and they really came together and, brainstormed, planned together, made a lot of phone calls to parents and families. The counselor led it alongside the teachers and administrators, and they really did an inquiry around what was the issues that were keeping their students from coming to school and what kind of socio-emotional learning issues were recurring in the community, and that they needed to support their students and the families in particular, and how they needed to integrate the families into those conversations. So we tried to provide some examples and tools in the book to think about integrating socio-emotional learning and socio-emotional literacy.
Would you talk a little bit more about those tools and the strategies?
Sure. There's, brain breaks are like an easy way, and they've become really popular post-pandemic. And I think, what I found is that before the pandemic, socio-emotional learning was kind of a hard sell, and now people are more open to it, which I think we're both excited about, because it's such an important part of learning in general. So brain breaks are one way, just kind of breaking up routine, creating routines that address kind of socio-emotional learning, creating brain activity, changing it up in the classroom, can be really important to success of our multilingual learners, to all students. But, there's ways you can integrate language and literacy activities to make it fun, to make it engaging. So that's one example we provide in the book. We also have more in-depth examples. For example, we have a power plan activity that we drew from a curriculum that some of our colleagues wrote that is really amazing in helping students self-reflect on how they deal with stress. And this is something that I've led often with adult educators to help them, guide them through, so they can think for themselves ahead of time what that's like as an adult learner, and then think about how they can set up that learning for their students. Those are just a couple of examples. We also think about, when you're designing interventions across the school, how do you build communication and protocols across teams? That's so important, especially when it comes to confidentiality and things that, need to be shared, but we have to have systems in place, to take precautions to support and protect our students. So we give an example of how we design a professional learning session for a school that looks that way, and what their experience was in developing communication protocols. So there's all different ways that you can address socio-emotional learning, from just the classroom to the team, like Joanna was describing, to across the entire school.
Yeah, when I came upon this chapter, I was like surprised. I was like, oh, school-wide systems. Why are we including SEL? And I thought, could you talk about that intentionality?
I think, when we talk about language and literacy, people understand that there has to be some kind of shared understandings of what language and literacy means. Although we're not always trained in it, we know and we accept that that's part of what has to happen in schools, and that I think it's accepted that we need to train in it. But socio-emotional learning, I think people think, usually when people think about socio-emotional learning, it's sort of as a one-off activity. But in the same way we do assessment, about where we are with socio-emotional learning skills, where our students are in language skills, we want to do the same thing for socio-emotional learning. The same way we set up systems to understand how and progress monitor our students in language literacy skills or in content, we want to do that in socio-emotional learning. So having screeners, having systems of progress monitoring in the classroom, integrating them into classroom instruction, these are all ways that, we can systematize what we're doing and integrate our socio-emotional learning with the instruction. These are things that can really help our students become more successful, right? As adults in the world, we need those skills. They're very, very important skills that we need in addition to our academic skills. They're really integrated, actually. So I get very excited, when I see teachers doing this, and I think that teachers are doing a tremendous job of integrating this. And in the face of the pandemic and everything that has happened, teachers have stepped up in new ways to support students in socio-emotional learning. And I think particularly for our multilingual learners, there are many different issues that our students face that are challenging. I'm building in sort of language scaffolds, culturally responsive content scaffolds to support our students. Those kinds of things become important as well when we're thinking about socio-emotional learning.
When I talk to teachers about the need for social emotional learning, I always say that people get hired for their hard skills, but they'll get fired for their soft skills. Right? And so we'll have students learn academic skills, but then they leave school and we haven't really developed the ability to be aware, to be resilient, to be empathetic, and to be listeners. Right? And so we would have failed them to be highly functioning contributors of society, even though they're highly literate and academic. Right? But it's more than just that. It's the soft skills that are important. So.
Yeah, I think there's that's one way to think about it, is who kids are, who we want support kids to become in the future. But I think the other side of it is what Lisa said earlier about, the challenges that the students face, right? And the context in which they live, right? We know that in the United States, a disproportionate number of multilingual learners live in poverty, right? Or they have been separated from their families, and they are at the minimum, right, dealing with all of the sort of emotional and social challenges that come with moving to a new country, and all of that, and also trauma, right, connected to immigration, or trauma connected to many other things. um, and um, and I think one of the reasons why that systemic approach and that integrated approach with creating that collaboration across teachers and counselors is so critical, because schools cannot sufficiently provide the support that students need because of all of those things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis without like a really strong safety net, right? And so that integration of social emotional learning and understanding how to support students in an integrated way, in a way that feels consistent, and that there are core practices that cut across the work that the adults are doing, is the only way to ensure that students have somebody to go to and consistently have resources and structures that allow for them to feel that they can bring their experiences and their whole selves to school, because sometimes school can be a haven for them. So I think that's, for me, that was another, and Lisa, in her data, she really brings some of that to life in how the counselors and the teachers together grapple with how to do that for students.
Right. So I really appreciate that. And in it, so you gave the other perspective. You said it's not just enough about us helping students becoming who we want them to become, but it's also about creating a support system ready to support students. And that's the other side of SEL. Are we ready to support students, right? So let's move to chapter 4. Can you talk about how we build system resilience with data?
Many school systems, even now, right? Even after, I would say, a long stretch of increased focus and attention on multilingual learners, that many systems continue to still be unaware of whether or not their systems are actually doing anything good for their kids in their buildings, in their districts. There's little information about what's really happening on the ground, about students feeding into the decision-making structures, right? And that kind of information rarely really floating up to the level of a principal or of chief academic officer or a superintendent. And so, when that happens, it's like the needs of the students are like out of sight, out of mind. And so what organizations really need is like a mechanism to create a feedback loop, right? And that's what system resilience is really about, right? Can the system adjust and get real-time data about what's actually happening with students? And this mechanism isn't very easy to build, right? To be honest, when a school, tries to put together a data framework to really help them deeply understand the needs and the strengths of the multilingual learners they're serving, it's not an easy task. But when they do try to go about doing it, it creates an ability for them to have an early warning system. They begin to see some gaps in how they're serving students, and hopefully through that they begin to change and improve their ways of working, to really be more culturally responsive, to be more linguistically responsive, right? And that ultimately comes from knowing the students deeply as human beings. So system resilience is really about helping school organizations create a way to be able to reformulate itself, right? And shift what they're doing, shift their practices, shift their approaches based on information about their students, and to really, I think, have like take a hard look in the mirror. Like, are they really serving students in the way that they say and they want to be serving? And so one of the roles of a school leader, actually, right, is to understand the ways in which the systems can be contributing to or impeding that growth. And there's a role in looking at sort of the traditional macro forms of data across the school, academic achievement, student achievement, right? Those things are important. They tell us some things, but they don't tell us everything, especially for students who are culturally and linguistically diverse, right? And so for multilingual learners, it's extremely important to get really close to the experiences of their students, their individual journeys, their language stories, their culture, and their literacy background. We have quite a bit in the book about understanding students' strengths in their home language literacy, and taking time to understand that, so that we're kind of decentering English language literacy as the only variable to really look at, how students are doing. And so we show some examples of how schools can create, like a student profile, right? And really compile a holistic picture of students' experiences, and that really gives teachers a much better picture of how they can respond to the students' needs in the classroom, um, and including, like, systems that can be used to, like, help teachers really make a commitment. I've noticed these new things about students, and now I have to make a commitment to respond. I'm going to have to put these sort of different supports and scaffolds in place for students, and I gotta try it, and I gotta do it for a while consistently so that students can feel successful over time. So yeah, I think that that's sort of the big picture, and we provide a lot of tools and a lot of examples of what that means, and how to utilize it, and what is significant about the different kinds of information. And I think our goal is not to say that a school needs to build a data system, whole hog, right? But to really know what's possible, and to kind of take baby steps, incremental steps in building that structure over time, in order to build that system resilience.
Could you describe a school that has built that data system for us and what that looks like?
Lisa, I think you should take that question.
Well, I mean, I think before I talk about a school, like I was just going to give a smaller example. Is that okay? Instead of an entire school, I think it's easier to focus in on some, like another tool from the book. Like Joanna described a profile, and that is one way of collecting information and learning about our students to have that kind of two-way feedback loop. Another way, and also across teams to have an understanding of students. Another way, we have a writing rubric that we include that we had developed at Bridges, and it's an assets-based rubric. So like in the world of assessment, there's often a gap in terms of culturally and linguistically responsive assessments that really assess multilingual learners, like also that shows what they can do and not just what they're not able to do. And so, for example, that rubric, gives credit to students for ideas in home language. The rubric itself, the language of the rubric is set up to say what students can do as well as what students are struggling with. It has both that language to identify, what students are able to do. That is so important, and that can build. I have watched that in schools repeatedly now. When teachers try out this rubric, it's a 6+1 traits writing rubric. We adapted it from another source, but we adapted it for siphon newcomers so that it also assesses students at the word and sentence level and phrase level, particularly for students who have interrupted schooling, for example, but along a continuum of students who have more advanced English language. But in any case, all students can get credit for home language. So wonderful to see our students who are starting out, in their Spanish language essay, a few sentences, they get credit, and the confidence that can build right away and open the learning process for that student. Whereas before, maybe they only used a specific English only rubric that shut them down and said, these are the things you can't do. It's amazing when you use a different tool, in the classroom or across a team in that case, how that can transform the way our students feel about learning. And also for us as educators, how we view our students. So I think I'm not giving you an example of a school, but I have been watching schools lately do this. And it's just very exciting to see a team of teachers to completely change their perception of a way a student is performing simply by an adjustment in the kind of tool they're using. So definitely that is happening, and it doesn't have to always happen across the whole school at once. Like, I think what I noticed is that often, and schools, it happens in pockets sometimes when schools are making change. It's not always going to happen in this like transformative way right in the beginning. But once you start to begin those creating those pockets of excellence where this kind of work is happening, then others can come in and watch that and see it. And that's how you can build and transform the school into a place where our students feel comfortable, where they feel successful, and where they feel validated for what they do know. Don't we all want that, right? But in a lot of cases, our multilingual learners have been invisible in our school, or kind of oriented in a deficit thinking manner. And so we need, as educators, to find tools, strategies, collaborative structures that will transform the way we practice. And certainly going back to what Joanna was saying, those systems have to be put in place. They can't be in isolation from one another. So we have examples in the book of teachers and educators doing that. So hopefully that will inspire others to try it out and not think it has to be this big, thing that they have to, somehow accomplish, but that it can be done a little at a time, this kind of transformation.
Your response made me think of Margaret Mead's quote where she said it's about the small groups that really have been able to make the big change. Like when we want societal changes, it's always look for the small groups. Those are the ones that are making the change, and then all we have to do is like highlight their work and model their work and highlight and expand upon their work to create that system of change. It's always the small groups. Let's move to the last chapter. How does one lead school improvement for multilingual learners?
Okay, so I guess one thing that we've talked a lot about is that there isn't one path or single way to lead school improvement for multilingual learners, and there are just no perfect answers. In the book, what we chose to do is share people's stories of leadership to help others troubleshoot and develop their own vision. So one of the examples in the book is of a dear colleague and administrator who helped build a more collegial environment among her teachers and structured meeting time that allowed for her teachers to use each other as a resource around L learning and inquiry. But this took years to develop, and I think that's really important, and she reflects on that. Another colleague in the book shares his story of becoming a first-time EL district administrator and the challenges he has in knowing the answers, quote unquote, and facing those structural obstacles, for example, to getting co-planning off the ground. So there are many obstacles he talks about and how he kind of builds a collaborative environment among the educators he works with to get that feedback loop that Joanna was describing. So these are only a couple of examples of how leaders share their stories to help others reflect on their own journey. And in addition to the stories from our leaders, we also have a practical self-assessment tool around different facets of leadership, rubrics, checklists to kind of help design that facilitative leadership, and ways that leaders can support each other in strategic planning and that can help and create and develop the systems that Joanna has been and we're both describing.
Going back to what Joanna said before, Joanna, you talked about when you work with the school to support their work, one of the first things you do is asking about their teaming practices. Could you tell us more about that process of not just talking about the teaming practice, but when you first work with a school, what are the things that you look for? I guess I'm trying to ask, like, what are the priorities when we're trying to create systems of support for students?
I think I would so like, looking for those team structures. How are teachers working together? What is the culture of the collaboration that's happening among teachers? And, is there a integration of actually not just multilingual learners, but all other students, right? That teachers want to be mindful of, right? And sort of have that equity focus in the way that they talk about students and in the way that they focus their attention. So I think that's one thing. I think the second is, what are the beliefs that they have about how multilingual learners learn? What are the underlying understandings and beliefs and their sort of theory about what it takes to help multilingual learners succeed in school? And this is not this varies, right, in different contexts. And again, like, there are research-based practices that we know of, but at the same time, how school communities interpret that and make it their own and live it out is very, like, specific to a school context. So I'm kind of looking for that, like, what is their language development framework? Like, how do they understand, you know, and then I think it's the leadership, right? What is the leadership's own thinking and approach around how they're going to create this change, right? Is it a, single one-to-one like coaching model, is it through collaborative inquiry, is it through, a sort of innovative professional learning system that they're putting in place? What is their approach to supporting teachers in addressing challenges? And within that, where are there opportunities to elevate the assets and needs of multilingual learners, right? So not necessarily tacking on a new program for the school in order to meet the needs of the students, but to see like what are the existing assets that the school already has? What are the practices and structures that already exist that can create opportunities where there's possibility for them to go deeper in supporting multilingual learners?
I really appreciate that because I can hear listeners saying like, "Oh, I have to add one more thing." It's like, no, it's not adding one more thing. It's looking for the opportunities to continue to enhance the work that you're already doing. Yeah. Let's end this way. Every, I know that you both often give keynotes, and often the keynote ends with a single message. Like, okay, if you remember nothing from this keynote, please remember this. What is a message that you would like uh, teachers and leaders to know about? If they know nothing else from this, or they remember nothing else from this conversation, what is the one thing you want them to keep in their hearts?
Well, I can share. On our website, Lisa and I chose to include this quote by James Clear. It's from a book called Atomic Habits. And he says, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." And I think, that quote really encapsulates, I think, the heart of what we're saying in the book, which is that, all schools have great goals and great ambitions for students. The reason why they're not always able to meet those is not because they don't have goals, right? It's not because they don't have goals to support multilingual learners. It's because their systems and the structures aren't quite the way that they need it to be responsive. So I would say, yeah, that's like our like our key quote.
Yeah, I love that quote. I think that's such a great quote and it captures it really well. And then the other thing I would just add is that there is no perfect system or perfect school or perfect team. And I think there's an illusion sometimes in leadership that we're trying to build something perfect or that we have to check all the boxes. But the reality is that's not the way it works. It's setting, when we talk about systems, what we're also really talking about is this opportunity and creating some kind of mechanism, communication to monitor what's happening. So we know when things go awry, we can revisit it and we can start over, because I think both of our experiences, things will always fall apart. That's the nature of schools. And how do we set ourselves up for success so that we have that mechanism, those systems in place that we can recover and revisit what's not working, what is working, and move forward and make change where we need to and recognize what's going well. That's really what it's about. So I'm really glad we had this opportunity to write this book, because we've had the privilege and opportunity to see so many amazing practitioners really work on this. And I hope that it really helps others think about and examine their own work and their own systems practice.
Well, I want to thank you both for your generosity and time, and also the labor that you took to write this book for the field, because teachers can't work alone. They need the collaboration of the village. They need all the systems to put in place for all their small little strategies, all their approaches to work inside the class. So I want to say thank you for helping us. Thank you for giving us a resource to help us rise to the level of our systems.